Alright, I think this is the last video I got that I want to watch with y'all. It's a big one, I think. But, it's by the Jacob dude, the Jacob Geller dude. We watched one of his videos a while back, but he has like this documentary type style going on. He's got like some big videos. But yeah, the conceptual failure of orbital lasers. I have no idea what this is going to be about besides lasers and apparently the failure of them. But he makes good videos, so even though it doesn't seem to be like related to video games, we're still watching it because, like I said, he makes good fucking videos. So here we go. It's a big one, I think. Yeah.
Watch this video ad-free and see the exclusive companion essay I made, The Failed Space Weapons of the US Military, only by watching on Nebula. Nebula and CuriosityStream sponsored this video. The Latin phrase Deus ex machina translates literally as God from the machine.
Like some Death Star shit.
In ancient Greek theater, where the phrase originated, this literal translation made sense. In several Greek plays, a seemingly unresolvable conflict would suddenly be swept away as a god entered the plot and solved a problem in a way mere mortals could not. Furthermore, this god wouldn't simply walk on stage, they'd descend from the heavens, lowered onto stage as if by magic, descending from a crane above the set.
What the fuck?
This happens in Alcestis, written by Euripides around 2,400 years ago.
Need to be
the titular character, Alcestis,
I don't think I ever
dies.
played it.
Oh no, what a tragedy. Only for Heracles to descend and fight death itself to bring her back to life. God from the machine. Deus ex machina. Nowadays, of course, the phrase rarely refers to gods or even machines. Instead, people use Deus ex machina to describe plot contrivances.
That's a remake for the
Solutions
Switch.
that
Oh
don't
yeah,
feel
they did
earned.
make a remake,
Both
didn't they?
the Deus and the machina have been analogized.
Yeah, it kind of. If I ever got it, it does feel like it do well on the Switch. I just chill back and
sure, it's fine.
Play it in bed or something.
It's a useful description of a specific plot event, but that original translation is just so evocative. God from the machine, an unimaginable force brought down to Earth, a level of artificially created power that makes all human problems into trivialities.
Oh my god.
Maybe that's why I can't stop thinking about orbital lasers.
Oh my god. Yeah, I guess this is kind of like Death Star shit. Yeah, kind of. We getting into it.
An orbital laser, a satellite in space with the ability to strike anywhere on the planet with a concentrated beam of energy, is about as fictional as Heracles or any other god that descended from a crane. But like those gods, this sci-fi weapon platform is ubiquitous enough that a story barely needs to explain it. A movie or game or anime can simply flash to some sort of threatening-looking spacecraft building a bright light at its tip, and we kind of get it. It represents the end game of militarization, the ultimate conclusion of the arms race.
Of course.
Death from above, anytime, anywhere. It's such a forceful idea that, despite being entirely fictional and almost as entirely impractical, it has demonstrably influenced real-life politics and military negotiation. Even in non-existence, the orbital laser has power. Let's talk about the basics first, though. With an agreed-upon fiction like this, I think the most useful thing will just be going through a bunch of examples, and as a plus, it means we'll get to look at a bunch of really cool stuff. Probably the most famous orbital laser is that old 1977 classic, the Death Star.
There it is.
It does have many of the hallmarks of the genre, namely, number 1, military trump card, number 2, big laser, number 3, in space. But the Death Star has a number of notable quirks that, while not totally disqualifying it, do set it apart from other examples. Most notably, it's only orbital temporarily. Because the Death Star's main thing is destroying a planet, having it locked in rotation around a planet doesn't make much sense. It actually has engines that can take it from place to place, and it also has a full crew aboard at all times. The Death Star is, in practice, a big spaceship. But because it does orbit, and because of its massive influence on space weapon imagery, it gets an honorary spot. More classical examples can be found in the James Bond franchise, which has at least 3 plots centering around orbital lasers.
Oh my god, of course it does.
GoldenEye and Die Another Day all have villains that control satellites that have varying abilities to zap from above. Diamonds Are Forever
I'm
might be my
hopeful
favorite
for when they
one just because of how
re-release
tiny
GoldenEye on the
pinpoint
Switch
its
and
beam
Xbox.
is.
How it's gonna play.
Submarine blows up.
No,
GoldenEye
so
satellite
nostalgic
actually
for that
fires
shit.
an EMP, though with all the fanfare of a more traditional laser, and by the time we get to Die Another Day's Icarus, it's basically slicing a continent in half. Importantly to our cultural conception of these weapons, they're all controlled from the ground by a wealthy lunatic. This becomes more or less a rule, though frequently that lunatic is a representative of a country's military. GoldenEye, within the fiction, was actually originally a Soviet weapon hijacked by a crime syndicate, which has interesting implications for something we'll talk about later. The Death Star and James Bond satellites are similar in that they're pretty integral parts of their respective
That sounds fucking
plots.
wild, Phoenix.
But what paradoxically I find more interesting is when the existence of the orbital laser is almost an afterthought, something that happens more and more as we move into video games and anime. One of the most visually stunning iterations of the weapon comes from the 2009 movie Redline, which is generally a lavishly animated movie about racing that just happens to have a massive space laser. Halfway through the plot, a big bioweapon named Funky Boy starts wreaking havoc on the racers, and so the ultra-militarized planet leader orders an orbital strike by the hyper-disintegrator cannon.
Fire the cannon at Funky Boy! Fire!
Redline doesn't need to explain what the hyper-disintegrator cannon is or how it came to exist. We just get it. We see a satellite with a bright light above a military base. We see 3 lasers converge and...
Kabooey.
There's a similar scene in the TV show Invincible. An orbital laser strike called in is basically a sight gag, or in the many Sonic games featuring Eggman-themed versions of these weapons, or in Tekken, or Vanquish, or the ever-present ion cannon in Command and Conquer.
Never really played Command and Conquer.
Or maybe my favorite, using the essence of orbital laser in Yakuza Like a Dragon to zap the hell out of some random street thugs.
Of course. Of course. Orbital laser, I choose you. This game is the best though. I still gotta play the Akira games.
All these scenes work.
I've mostly
They
been
don't leave the
recommended
audience
Like a
confused,
Dragon though.
despite how offhandedly the concept is thrown out. And that's because the important thing about an orbital laser isn't its literal existence, but what it represents. They're essentially a shorthand for a pinpoint nuke, its power only matched by how omnipresent the threat is, literally hanging overhead at all times. And because it's a sci-fi invention, it comes without all the baggage
Like a Dragon
we know
is very
of real
different from the
nukes.
other ones.
Travel time, radioactive
Has a nuclear
fallout,
tag.
endless
Yeah.
collateral damage. A powerful person on the ground just pushes a button, and somewhere else something explodes. The ultimate flex, the end of the arms race. Except it's not really. And to get into that, we have to talk about one of the best orbital lasers of all time, Soul, from Akira. In the movie, Soul gets about a minute of screen time. It fires twice, looks cool while doing it, then gets destroyed and falls down to Earth. Like all things Akira, if we really want to understand it, we have to go back to the manga. All 2,100 pages of it. With its first issue released in 1982 and its last in 1990, Akira is about 1,000 different things. It's about punk youth movements, about drugs, about poverty-hostile urban development. It's about spirituality and death, and a pretty full-throated endorsement of honest-to-God anarchy. But within all that, the most consistent theme of Akira might be a story of military escalation. How could it not be when these are the first two panels?
Holy shit.
The first page of Akira tells us that the explosion we see is a new type of bomb detonated over the metropolitan area of Japan, an explosion that sparked a new world war. The historical parallels are obvious. The last nuclear chapter of World War II mirrored as the opening chapter of World War III. But the explosion is not actually nuclear, nor was it launched from a foreign power. To make a very long story short, that opening explosion was caused by the subject of a government-led parapsychology project in Japan. The project discovered that some children held latent psychic abilities and that these abilities could be brought to the surface and weaponized through a combination of medication, training, and psychological abuse. Akira, the manga's namesake, was the most powerful child ever found by the project, and one of his psychic awakenings created that explosion we see in the first two pages.
Gotcha.
The explosion that started World War III. Do you get it? The message here isn't that war pushes militaries to create new weapons, it's the inverse. The creation of new weapons is, in itself, what facilitates war. World War III occurred explicitly because of the development of these weaponized children. The orbital lasers of Akira, therefore, narratively rhyme with the parapsychology project. We see two of them in the story, the Japanese-controlled Soul and the American-controlled Floyd. They too are objects of immense power and symptoms of endless military buildup. They're the end game of an old arms race, one before the torturous development of psychic children. And in the manga, just like those psychic kids, the orbital lasers are completely f***ing useless to the militaries that created them. This is honestly my favorite part of Soul and
You never
Floyd
read or
and
watched
Akira.
Akira? I haven't
They
either.
are stunningly drawn, incredibly powerful looking, and
Take away my
basically
weave
never
card.
do anything useful. The first time Soul is fired, it's attempting to stop two children from escaping a military base, and guess what? It doesn't work. The second time it's fired, it triggers a psychic reaction from one of the characters that destroys half the city. The third time it's fired, it again only pisses off the antagonist, and the fourth time, we'll get to that. Even better is Floyd, the satellite laser which the Americans used to try and wipe out Neo-Tokyo completely. Its capabilities are clearly enormous, its destructive potential nearly unlimited, and yet the only thing it manages to do is crash right back down on the Americans' heads. Okay, no, I have to actually tell you what happens here. So this group of Americans has been chilling offshore in an aircraft carrier for hundreds of pages, and eventually the commander is like,
How many times do they gotta find the laser
destroy
screen not
all
working?
of Neo-Tokyo. That's the only way to resolve this. And so they start to fire the laser, but as they do, Tetsuo, the main psychic boy everyone is fighting, is like, F this, and flies up into space and attacks the satellite. And a version of this happens in the movie, but what doesn't happen is Tetsuo starts riding the massive orbital platform back down to Earth towards the Americans who fired it in the first place, and we get maybe the single hardest page of the whole story, and it's falling, and suddenly lasers start coming out of the sky at the aircraft carrier, and the commander is like, the laser cannon is still functional, and then the whole thing just smashes into the character and everything blows up and it fucking rules. Anyway, my point is this. The multiple orbital lasers of Akira are technologically impressive, visually intimidating, and absolutely impotent. Their failures throughout the story aren't about the shortcomings of their specific designs, they represent the inadequacy of military technology as a whole as a conflict preventative. Soul and Floyd are drawn as their country's respective deus ex machinas, divine light that can incinerate the very dangers they've created. When Japan's newest military project, the Psychic Children, goes haywire, the commanders say that the orbital lasers are their only hope. But the weapon's power is easily subverted. Over and over, they destroy everything they were theoretically created to protect. Now let's talk about Ronald Reagan. Aside from ignoring and exacerbating the AIDS crisis, instigating the war on drugs explicitly to facilitate the incarceration of black Americans, kickstarting the economic policy that would crush social mobility while causing inequality to skyrocket, and being a top 5 contender for most dementia while allowed to launch a nuclear strike, one of Reagan's most prominent presidential ambitions was the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. On March 23, 1983, 3 months after the first issue of Akira, and 2 months before the release of Return of the Jedi, Ronald Reagan spoke live to the nation about the nuclear threat facing Americans from the Soviets. He said that while America was dismantling its older intercontinental missiles, the Soviet Union was only increasing their stock. He said that when he took office in 1981, he was appalled by the state of the United States Armed Forces. He said that
in 1955, defense took up more than half of the federal budget. By 1980, this spending had fallen to a low of 23%.
But most significantly, he said, in a surprise to both the Pentagon and the rest of Washington, that the days of simply relying on nuclear deterrence, on mutually assured destruction, should come to an end.
This is why I'm speaking to you tonight, to urge you to tell your senators and congressmen that you know we must continue to restore our military strength.
He said that America should use its strength and technology to stop the threat of a nuclear attack by intercepting ballistic missiles before they reach their destinations. He said, in a genuinely moving turn of phrase, "I call upon the scientific community in our country, those who gave us nuclear weapons, to turn their great talents now to the cause of mankind and world peace, to give us the means of rendering these nuclear weapons impotent and obsolete." Although Reagan's speech neglected to mention the form these missile defense systems would take, further briefings in the coming days would confirm the almost unbelievable fact that the president was indeed talking about space lasers. It shouldn't be a surprise that the press immediately nicknamed the project Star Wars. Just weeks earlier, Reagan had spoken publicly about the Soviet evil empire.
Aggressive impulses of an evil empire.
And apparently White House staffers already referred to that as the Darth Vader speech. The president was working in the realm of science fiction. This wasn't out of character for him. Reagan often seemed to confuse real life and media. He would tell the story of a valiant pilot going down with his bomber that turned out to be from the war movie A Wing and a Prayer. He would speak of his own experience photographing atrocities in German death camps, when in reality he only watched a documentary on the subject. Reagan never left California during the war. As an aside, almost any story involving Reagan will end with the question, is he actually that stupid, or is he leveraging that perceived incompetence in order to enact great cruelty? And I just have to say, I don't know. I don't know. Most writing about Reagan does include many quotes of his staff treating him basically like a trained monkey. George Bush, his vice president, said Reagan, quote, found it hard to think and express his own ideas simultaneously.
Wow.
So on that level of evil or incompetent, I tend to default to, yes, both. The Cold War was the defining historical era of Reagan's presidency, and negotiations between the US and Soviet Union on such topics as nuclear disarmament necessitated in-depth knowledge of each country's military capability and the capabilities of many different individual types of weapons. This was not Reagan's forte. As soon as conversation shifted away from his scripted talking points, the president would lose focus and default to his classic anecdotes. With this in mind, the appeal of an automated system that would shoot down incoming missiles is obvious. SDI, a bunch of lasers in space, actually presented a sort of radical simplicity that disarmament couldn't. You don't have to negotiate if you simply have a win button. Star Wars was the obvious modern touchpoint for news media writing about the proposal. A simple story of good versus evil featuring lots of technology so advanced it might as well be magic. But Reagan himself didn't use such modern references to make the case for SDI. Actually, author Francis Fitzgerald theorizes that Reagan's true cultural touchpoints were significantly older. like a couple thousand years older. Fitzgerald
so a little
writes
bit
that
back in the
Reagan's
day.
usage of the phrase evil empire, first uttered when speaking to the National Association of Evangelicals, wasn't invoked to reference Darth Vader, but the biblical conception of evil, as in
An evil empire that will appear in the end
Oh my God.
the leadership of the Antichrist, one that will do battle with Christ and his saints
Oh
on the
my,
field of
holy
Armageddon.
shit!
whether a cynical
took a
ploy
turn.
for the support of America's Christian fundamentalists, or because it was the lens through which he actually saw the world, or again, both. Reagan's language positioned the Soviet Union as the malevolent side of a divine conflict. SDI, Star Wars, orbital lasers, whatever you want to call them, it's clear where they fit into the metaphor here. On the oncoming fields of Armageddon, they would be Reagan's Deus Ex Machina, his God from the machine. From this perspective, the total non-existence of any of the technology required to create a functional space-based missile defense network is almost a non-issue. He has recontextualized space lasers as a matter of faith. Again and again, when he and others were questioned on how any of this was possible, the response was simply one of committed, near-religious belief. More than once, the president referred to SDI as my dream. He said that it could, quote, save humanity itself. James Abramson, the director of this initiative, adopted that kind of language as well. I don't think anything in this country is technically impossible, he said. We have a nation which indeed can produce miracles. The tactic worked. Soon, a substantial proportion of the country felt the notion that America could not create a functioning system of space lasers was near blasphemy. As Fitzgerald writes, when the experts insisted that science was not magic and that American technology could not do everything, they would be accused of a lack of patriotism. In 1968, the science fiction author Arthur Clarke first wrote a sentence that would eventually be quoted ad nauseum. Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. But often, fantasies of a new scientific development that will cure deep-seated societal issues reveal an inverse to Clarke's statement. Any piece of magic, couched in enough inaccessibly technical claims, can be disguised as prospective technology. It's this inverse that allows a video game series as grungy and non-magical as Gears of War to have a giant divine beam of light fall out of the sky whenever the heroes are in trouble. And it's not just once. This beam is one of the series' defining pieces of imagery. Maybe
yeah, and it's fun to play, by the way. It's fun to use that thing. I haven't played Gears of War 4 or 5 yet.
An orbital laser of such immense capability.
But in the first games, oh my god.
Franchise's final bosses
when you first get to use it, it's fucking awesome.
When found in gameplay, it's often the ultimate trump card. Even its name, although not biblical as a whole, is tremendously evocative. God's word like fire, like a hammer which shatters rock. The weapon itself built to usher in a new era. The path of the righteous is like the light of dawn. Stylistically, the hammer is in line with what we've come to expect from the science fiction world of orbital lasers. Blinding, instantaneous. The handheld beacon used to target the laser feels almost exactly like the one used by the general in Akira. But what's most interesting about the Hammer of Dawn is how the series refuses to let it be a simple Deus Ex Machina. In contrast, for every problem the hammer rescues our heroes from, it creates a dozen more. While the Lancer, the chainsaw gun, might represent the gung-ho violence the franchise allows individual soldiers, the Hammer of Dawn instead remains Gears' symbol of what happens when every metric of stability is sacrificed in the name of absolute power. Although Gears is a series largely focused on fighting non-human creepy crawlies, the first appearance of the Hammer of Dawn, chronologically speaking, is in a very human war. At the beginning of Gears 4, you play a soldier of the COG army, raiding an enemy base explicitly to steal their
I haven't
research
played
on
Gears
an
4 or
orbital
5,
weapons platform.
so I don't know this.
In one of the supplemental comics, the COG scientists speak of the technology with a sort of radical optimism, echoing Reagan's declarations of oncoming world peace. Perhaps this weapon will be so powerful that it could, in fact, end all wars.
Yeah.
But the soldiers in the raid have no such illusions. When one member of the team asks, "So what does this Hammer of Dawn thing do anyway?" another answers bluntly, "It wins the war." And it does. The COG uses their operational orbital lasers to eradicate their human enemies and bring about their surrender, and what follows is a period of world peace that lasts all of 6 weeks. Then the aforementioned creepy crawlies emerge from the ground and throw the whole planet into war again. In a bitingly clever little move, Gears 4 immediately follows the raid to steal the Hammer of Dawn with a demonstration of its inadequacy. It flashes forward to Emergence Day and hands you control of the laser. This is it, the weapon that wins the war. Except, of course, it cannot. And even with its tremendous power, you fall under the endless horde. The rest of the Hammer's history in Gears follows this same general arc. Is it effective at dealing death? Yes, absolutely. No one could deny. But that's never quite enough. In a decision hugely important to the series' emotional and literal atmosphere, the COG army eventually fires an endless barrage of hammer strikes on every enemy-occupied territory on the planet, vaporizing cities, killing billions, and throwing the climate into chaos. The iconic ruins of the Gears series, burnt-out skylines and crumbling highways, are often remnants of that decision. And yet, the enemy is not stopped. They, like the humans, are simply driven to further aggression and desperation because the world is now near uninhabitable. Like Akira, the development of new weapons is what facilitates new wars. Like Akira, even after Armageddon, they can't help but keep using the weapons because there is no other option. Gears 5 spends more time on the laser than any other title in the franchise, and
I gotta play Gears 4 and 5.
damning of all. Just hours into the game, the protagonist is overwhelmed and orders an orbital strike on his position.
All of them
For a moment,
co-op
it's a
with
fun
Yomi.
and bombastic scene. He runs down the street as that divine light follows, incinerating every baddie in its path. But then all the enemies are dead, and the beam keeps going, disconnected from ground control. It veers directly into a bus full of civilian refugees.
Damn.
In its opening levels, Gears 5 gives a violent refutation of the concept of the Hammer of Dawn as something that can be purely a tool of good. And then, the middle third of the game is devoted almost entirely to launching a satellite that will restore functionality to the hammer. Really? It seems the game begs you to ask, as we ride through the storms created by this weapon and deal with the emotional fallout of its consistent failings, we're going to launch another one? But there's no other choice, of course. The Hammer of Dawn has simply been factored into the machinery of conflict alongside light mass bombs, energy waves, and countless others. The Gears of War series has no shortage of war-ending weapons, and yet, through the constant militaristic heightening of its world, it's created an environment where the only solution is further escalation, its wars all the more massive and deadly because of the weapons designed to end them. There's a crucial difference between virtually all fictional representations of space lasers and the kind the US attempted to build in the 80s. There was never, at least publicly, any ambitions to hit the ground with an orbital platform. It was, in proposal, a purely defensive system that would shoot down missiles before they reached their target. But SDI blurred the line between offense and defense because the previous defense, mutually assured destruction, was contingent on the fact that war would be
that a wild
equally
thing to say?
catastrophic for each side.
Our
And
defense
whether
was
through
mutually
actual
assured
naivete or
destruction.
strategic playing dumb, Reagan seemed to not understand the conflict this kind of defense system would create. Because at the same time as scientists were ostensibly creating this missile defense system, the rest of the Cold War was still very much happening. Reading the sequence of negotiations between the US and USSR reveals that far from ushering in the end of war, America's insistence on continuing SDI development was actually responsible for prolonging it. Of course it did. It was a system that, if effective, would allow the US to launch a nuclear strike with complete impunity, with no regard to the testy peace of mutually assured destruction. Reagan's utopian proposal of the initiative promised to avert Armageddon, but his
Fucking
inflexibility
Reagan, I
on
swear to God.
negotiations surrounding it, his demand that the project continue at full speed, meant that the entire world continued to teeter on the edge of end times. A strange note I do want to mention is that more than once, Reagan mentioned that after the US figured out how to make space lasers work, they would give them to the Soviets, so each side would be equally defended. While this seems tremendously important on a policy level, it's actually not, because no one ever took this seriously. The US didn't intend on doing it, the Soviets had no expectation that it would ever happen. It's seemingly just one of those things that Reagan said and everyone collectively agreed, well, that part is nonsense. Fortunately,
So
the
like
US never even had the
99.9% of what he
opportunity
said.
to back out on this commitment because the Cold War ended. SDI did not ultimately play
done
much of a
kinda
role
sick.
in
The back
negotiations
picture,
and
he smells
certainly
like
was not an
shit
advantage
sand.
for the American
Oh my God, he's
position.
smelly.
To be honest,
Smelly
it just
cat
seems
boy.
that the Soviets figured out that the program was a fantasy. Gorbachev said, quote, "Mr. President, you do what you think you have to do. And if in the end you think you have a system you want to deploy, go ahead and deploy it.
I love
Who
the
am
Final
to tell you what
Fantasy
to do?
style
I
right
think
here.
you're wasting money. I don't think it will work. But if that's what you want to do, go ahead." And then he said, quote, "Let's talk about something else." Ironically, in the following negotiations, America
Wow.
offered to reduce their own number of ballistic missiles if they could keep working on SDI, in the kind of devastating skewer only possible through impersonal historical writing. Francis Fitzgerald notes, "This was the ultimate irony. For the past 3.5 years, the American negotiator had been working on a grand compromise in which the US would use the SDI bluff as a bargaining chip to extract major concessions on offensive weapons from the Soviet Union. But now he was offering the Soviets a concession on offensive weapons for the sake of a non-existent defense." In retrospect, one of the most fascinating things about the whole strategic defense
Oh, is that what the
initiative
text looks like in
is
the Phoenix Wright games
scattershot
too?
ideas of what it could be
Yeah, it
used
gave
for
me the old,
outside its initial proposal.
Final Fantasy game vibe.
Even within the Cold War, many on the right pushed for more aggressive uses of SDI. Dan Quayle and Pete Wilson urged the president to deploy an early version of SDI to protect European military assets, hardly a defensive maneuver. After the end of the Cold War, then President Bush said that SDI could serve an important role in defending from the ballistic missiles that would surely soon be coming from rogue states, or even those that
Yeah,
were,
I couldn't
quote,
tell what the
launched
music
by
was from.
accident. Most telling is the writing of the military lobbyist Daniel Graham, who compared weapon platforms in space to Viking warships controlling the seas. He wrote that this was a chance for the US to take and hold space, building up additional weaponry and tech as it became available. A bold new frontier of imperialism. We can do it! All these ideas for what the space lasers should become after the primary reason for their existence ended have, to me, the same subtext. We spent billions and billions and billions of dollars on this thing. We've got to figure out something to do with it. Its existence creates opportunities for usage in the minds of its biggest supporters. Which is ironic, because if there's one thing about the Strategic Defense Initiative, it's that it never existed in anything close to its original proposal. In a hilariously candid admission, many of the scientists working on SDI admitted that much of the progress they made over several years was a greater understanding
Wish there
of
was
the
a new Star Wars
difficulties
game
of
where we just
mounting an
got to be
effective
evil.
strategic
Would be
defense.
bad. Yeah.
The lasers didn't work, the platforms didn't work, the preliminary tests they used to argue for continued funding were largely faked. There was never even a clear consensus on what defense meant. Reagan's original speech promised absolute 100% shelter from a nuclear barrage, but this level of efficacy was basically never on the table. Others argued that the system should simply defend America's nuclear launch sites, which, what are we even doing here? What's the point? That's just mutually assured destruction with more steps. What Reagan
Yeah, I want a
failed or
Star Wars
refused
game
to
where you
comprehend,
can,
what
like,
the public failed or refused to comprehend,
not be a Jedi
is that in real
or a
life,
Sith.
a system like SDI that operates
Like, you could
less
just
than
literally be
perfectly
a wandering
is
Force
in many
user.
ways worse than no system at all. American foreign policy would likely get more hawkish, not less, if
like,
politicians
the Star
believed there was
Wars-
little fear of reprisal. Enemy countries
universe
would likely escalate
is
their
like
own arms construction
has so
in
much
response.
potential for
Think about a
stories
missile defense system that's effective
that have just
90% of the
gone
time
ignored, really.
against a simultaneous launch
That have
of
nothing to do with
1,000
Jedi or
missiles.
Sith.
That still means total nuclear annihilation. Because what people wanted,
I can
what
see more
Reagan
distinction
wanted,
between
what
different Jedi.
civilians
Yeah, that too.
wanted,
Yeah.
wasn't scientific, not really. They wanted a magic shield, a win button, a god from the machine. Polls of the time often showed that Americans believed the US already had a system that would defend them from foreign missile strikes. Fitzgerald attributes this to the fact that the alternative, that they were truly vulnerable to nuclear apocalypse, was almost too existentially terrifying to accept. This is how SDI existed without ever existing, a fantasy of scientific escape from the horrors of reality. The one time Soul functions successfully in Akira, the one time its laser strike doesn't simply perpetuate chaos, is explicitly and obviously because of magic.
Yeah.
The beam
There was like so many
bends.
different
The
like
one thing we know from all our depictions of this technology
sections
that it
of
cannot
Jedi.
do, it bends and hits its target. It accomplishes its goal not because of the tech,
but also
but in spite of it. God appears
there's like
from
so
the
many different
machine, and in
histories
doing
of
so
Jedi and
underscores that
Sith
it is a
and
magic idea.
just
that
Force
greater
users
weapons
in
can
general
lead to greater safety. It is a
that
magic
have just gone
idea
unexplored.
that the end of war would ever be brought about by ever-increasing military expenditure. Like an actor descending from a crane, orbital lasers are a fun thing to watch that become laughably, hopelessly naive the second someone suggests that perhaps real life should work like this. It is possible, probable even, that we will have space lasers one day. On a long enough timeline, little will stay science fiction. But I will tell you right now that it will not be the divine light envisioned by writers and representatives alike. Super weapons in reality and fiction offer only the illusion of invincibility. A false claim.
Yeah, because the Sith stuff, like
utopia can
Sith,
be ushered in by a tool
there's
that deals in death.
Sith that had like families and stuff, like they had just regular lives.
Just because SDI never produced anything that worked didn't mean that it didn't produce ideas. In fact, the program produced an incredible volume of ideas, their ambition only matched by their complete impracticality. I've made a completely separate video on Nebula about this, the failed space weapons of the US military, where we can absolutely dive into all the truly absurd
I keep hearing
things
about
being
Nebula.
proposed
Like,
with
what
a
the fuck
straight
is Nebula?
face. Project Excalibur dares to ask, what if the problem with those other lasers is that they weren't
Discovery
powered by
poster,
a
you notice
nuclear
that?
bomb? Guided Electromagnetic Defense Interceptor, or JEDI. Gorbachev's advisors told him that they could shoot down every SDI proposal with 10% of the project's budget. This video joins my many other Nebula
have to pay for it.
exclusive
Yeah,
essays,
it sounds
hours
interesting.
of content at this point, and it can be yours for less than $15 a year. Follow the link in the description, sign up to Curiosity
fair, that's
Stream
not-
with their
that's not a bad
cheapest
price,
annual plan,
but-
just over $1 a month, and you'll get access to both Curiosity Stream and Nebula for an entire year. CuriosityStream.com/Jacob Geller. Signing up for Nebula
Don't
is
pay for it,
legitimately
basically,
one of
YouTube
the
video
best
essay.
ways you can support me making these kinds of videos. But you don't even have to care about that, because it's the only way for you to get all the exclusive content I'm throwing up there. Follow the link in the description, watch my companion video to this.
Yeah, if YouTube
and then
wasn't
go
such a
wild finding
shithole,
all the other stuff you've been missing out on.
video makers in general wouldn't have to like try to get income from other places like this. That's a good video though. I wasn't expecting so much for fucking space lasers. That was he does really good videos though. Oh, it's very, very enjoyable. Like, I wasn't expecting like the conceptual failure of orbital lasers. Like that was a lot. That was a lot. But I never really thought about it. Cause like I know it's like been a game mechanic. I know it's been in animes and movies and TV shows. It's been in all media really, basically. But never really thought of it in this way. Yeah, it's YouTube. Which is a better alternative to YouTube. Dailymotion fucking sucks ass. Yes. And fucking Vimeo. Oh my god. I've never even gone to that. I have gone on Dailymotion, but that was back when they started fucking around with the whole YouTube thing, with the whole copyright situation, where they were taking down videos left and right. And so everybody uploaded shit on the Dailymotion. That was a good video though. That was a good video. I quite enjoyed it. But yeah, this is The Conceptual Failure of Orbital Lasers by Jacob Geller. Like, I recommend checking him out. Makes good video essay things. It's very well done, very well researched, very fun to watch.